A very warm welcome to this event at the Lockdown LitFest, where we have a treat in store for you today. As ever, we hope you're well, we hope you're keeping safe, and we hope you're being careful as lockdown is slowly being released. A fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, Anthony Sattin, is a British journalist and broadcaster and the author of several very highly acclaimed books of history and travel. He read for a literature degree at the University of Warwick and then an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia. And his main area of interest is the Middle East and Africa, particularly Egypt. And he's lived and travelled extensively in these regions. He's been a long-time contributor to the Sunday Times Travel and Books pages and to Condé Nast Traveller. And his written work has appeared in a number of other international publications, including The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, The Independent, The Guardian, Geographical Magazine, on which he sits on the editorial advisory board. And he's also written several guidebooks in the Lonely Planet series, including those on Egypt and Algeria. Giles Foden, who knows a thing about good writing, has called Anthony one of the 10 key influences in modern travel writing. Anthony Sattin, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest.
Paul, thank you very much for inviting me. What a treat.
Well, it's a real pleasure to see you, and I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm a huge fan of your writing, as are tens, hundreds of thousands of people around the world. First of all, are you well? Are you safe? And where are you speaking to us from?
I am well, I am safe, and I'm speaking to you from West London, which is sort of bizarre for somebody who travels so much. But yeah, I've been here since lockdown, since the middle of March in West London.
Did you have to cancel travel plans? Were you meant to be somewhere else?
Oh, I was somewhere else. I was on the Nile when the Egyptian Prime Minister announced he was closing the airports for commercial traffic. So we scrambled on the last flight back to London, the last scheduled flight.
Really, the last from Cairo?
From Cairo, yeah, from Cairo to London, yeah.
Oh, good heavens! That's
what a performance.
Yeah, what a performance. Well, I'm pleased that you're safe and well. What I want to do with you, actually, because you've written so much and you've written in a number of areas, I'd like to talk about your life as a writer, if that's possible. So can we talk about start points? Obviously, you read literature at Warwick. You then did an MA in creative writing at the famed UEA. I always get that wrong. When was that trigger point, that hinge point in your life as the young Anthony Sattin, when you thought, oh, hold on, words are important. They communicate so much. People write them. I want to do that job.
Well, I'm not sure I saw it as a job initially. I just saw it as something that I had to do. And you know, when you're a teenager, I mean, everybody I knew was I either had a diary or was writing poetry or songs or whatever. And I wrote poetry, and very bad poetry, really tortured stuff. I was a very tortured teenager. But I just didn't stop. Everybody grows out of it, except I didn't. And they turned into, then they were prose poems, and then from prose poems they turned into short stories, very intense short stories. And then it just got longer, and I realized that part of me needs to write, and part of me is not fulfilled unless I'm writing. And I realized that quite early on, certainly in my late teens, early 20s. But I was very slow at doing lots of things. I took 2 years off between school and university. Was traveling for those 2 years. I then took several years between Warwick and doing the writing course. When I was writing, I'd written a novel and a collection of short stories before I went to UEA. So I was 27 by then, I think.
Well, there's no expiry date on brilliance, I suppose, is the only thing that we can say that. This may sound, I'm sort of ashamed to ask this question of you, Anthony, but hopefully it's a little more deep than it first appears. To your mind, what is a writer?
Well, a writer is somebody. We used to talk about this actually when we were at UEA. We were all, there was sort of only 7 or 8 of us on the course at that time, and I think now there's a lot of people. And it was a question of, am I a writer if I'm not published? And there was all that sort of agonizing about when will we be published? How does that magical thing happen? As though it was, you just get published and then everything falls into place. Everything will be perfect. Of course, once you get published, you realize that there's the next step as well. And that is you need to sell books, and you want to be reviewed, and you want to be recognized, and you want your work to be recognized. But I always said, I'm a writer if I write. and there are quite a few writers who don't write very much. It's that compulsion to write. I think that for me that's important.
I quite like that. So, what is an author?
Well, I write. I have written in various genres. I wrote fiction, short stories, and then novels, and then I've written biographies and straight history and travel with history, and a sort of travel book that's actually got quite a lot of anthropology in it. But I've also written quite a lot of journalism. I had a family to support, and children and things like that. So I do distinguish between the journalism I did and the books I write. And I think for me, an author is somebody who writes books, and the rest of it falls into other categories.
I rather like that. That's very good. Yes. My first discovery of your writing was a book that's published quite some time ago now, given how old I've got in the last 20 years. It was called The Gates of Africa, Death, Discovery, and the Search for Timbuktu, which really, having lived in Africa, spent a lot of time in Africa, really opened up a sense of Africa that I hadn't hitherto been unaware of. Can we use that as an example for what the importance is, what the responsibility is, one, of writing history, and two, of writing about a nation that is not your own, how you approach that?
Oh, yeah. Well, all my books have come about a very, very long gestation process. And usually, in fact, always not a straight line either. It's always been sort of, all sorts of things have happened on the way. And I was intending to write a biography of a man who I felt sort of personally involved in, called Jean-Louis Burckhardt, who was this great traveler. He's if anybody knows anything about him, it's as the first European to see Petra in Jordan and Abu Simbel in Egypt since antiquity or whatever. But he wasn't supposed to be doing that. He was supposed to be going to Timbuktu, and he's also the first European to make the Hajj to Mecca and write about it. He by then was it wasn't quite clear whether he converted to Islam or whether he was pretending to be a Muslim. But anyway, in 1810s, he managed to get to Mecca and then came back and wrote about it. And I was fascinated by him, and I wanted to write a biography, and I told my publisher about it, and my publisher realized that there had been a biography, which I thought was not a very good one, that imprint, I shan't name it, had published in the 60s. And so rather than commission me to write my book, he put their old one back in print. And I was then left thinking, okay, what shall I do? And so I started looking at the people who sent him traveling in Africa. He was a man of sort of noble Swiss family, friends of Goethe, Edward Gibbon on his way down to Italy, where he sort of fell for the idea of the Roman Empire, stopped and stayed with the family. And they were a very well-known family. And during the Napoleonic Wars, the family fell on hard times. And so Jean-Louis was left wondering what to do with himself. And he came to England, the beacon of liberty and democracy, to, as he thought, to do some good. And then he fell on hard times. And then he met this man, Joseph Banks, who said, why don't you go traveling for it? And they had just started this project of trying to get people into Central Africa, into the center of Africa. They knew what was all around the coast, but they had no idea what was in the interior of Africa. And it was tied up with a project trying to end the slave trade. But recognizing that you can't stop trade, you can divert it. And so they were wondering what there was in West Africa that could be traded in the place of slaves. And they fixed on gold, and they fixed on Timbuktu as this great place at the center of the gold trade. And so they sent him traveling. And I just, I thought that was a wonderful story. And that's obviously the starting point for anything I'm going to write. Is it a great story? Am I excited by it? Because if I'm not excited by it. And there's always been this, I didn't know that. And there's so many things about this organization that I didn't know, that I thought touched on what was happening around me at the time. And I went to West Africa. I traveled all over the places that the African Association travelers went. I went to Timbuktu. I went along the Niger River. I went to Gambia and Senegal and whatever. And I went into the universities to try and find, I wanted the African side of the story of the white man coming. I had the white man story, but I wanted the local version. And I was told by professors there that if the story was out there, it hadn't been found, and it probably existed in some sort of oral tradition, in the griots, still telling the tales. But then no academic that he knew of had done that work. And since then, I'm happy to report, in the last 10 years, people have done that, and that sort of story is coming out, because that's fascinating as well.
Absolutely. Commendations to you. You're the first person ever to use the word griot here on the Lockdown LitFest. Delighted that it was you. Before we come to how you choose what you dedicate your work to, how you decide which of the many ideas that you have is worthy of 2, 3, 4, 5 years investigation and research, tell us what it is about travel. What you said, that in between doing your degree and doing your MA, you traveled. What is it about this region, the Middle East and the parts of Africa that you've written about, that resonate with you so strongly? I know more recently you went on an author tour in Iran, and you came back just full of joy and life from the mere act of traveling and some of the things that you'd seen.
That's right. Well, what is it about the Middle East? Well, firstly, it's just over there. It's just beyond, the world that is recognizably sort of the Roman language world. You cross the Mediterranean, and suddenly you're in an entirely different culture, a different mindset, obviously different religion mostly, different languages, and a different landscape. And I didn't have very much. I was 18 when I first went to the Middle East. Where was I going to go? I went to the Middle East. I didn't have money to go anywhere else. Imagine if I'd gone to South America. Maybe my life would have been so different. But it really grabbed me, and I was very taken. Particularly, I remember sitting with a Druze family, aged 18. They'd invited me. They were extremely poor, and as was I. I mean, I had no money at all. And they shared this huge meal. There was sort of probably 25, 30 people sitting around eating and sharing these dishes. And I so loved that sense of community and sense of belonging. And I'm not the first person to say that the most important thing about travel are the people that you meet. And I felt a bond. I felt a sort of kinship there, which has nothing to do with my background at all. I mean, my family are Black Sea people and Central European. They're not from the Middle East at all. But it just spoke to me, and I've been going back there ever since. And obviously, I went. I went between my 2 degrees, and then I started going back afterwards. I'd been sitting in my room, and at that point I had just this sort of bed sit in West London after UEA, and I was writing fiction, and I finished another novel, and I was so sort of skinny and miserable. I've been staring out of this window, and I just thought, I've got to get out of here. And I had a girlfriend who just made some money on some property deal or something, who said, let's go. It was sort of February, March, when everybody's suffering from daylight deficiency.
Yeah.
And she said, let's go somewhere sunny. And I said, I want to go back to Egypt. And so we went, and she hated it from the minute we set foot on the tarmac. It was like, and I loved it. It just, and it was the end of one relationship and the beginning of another.
A relationship with Egypt, which brings us neatly to actually A Winter on the Nile, because, of course, in mid-19th century, Europe was fascinated with Egypt, a fascination that endures to this day. Can you talk us through this fantastic... I remember meeting you on the street some many years ago, and you said, I've just found this most extraordinary piece of information. I think were you writing...
I was doing a history of...
collection of Florence Nightingale's letters or something, is that right?
Well, I was writing... the thing that came out of that trip to Egypt was and my desperation to get out of my room in West London was I devised this book that was going to take me around the world, looking at the sort of telling the social history of the British Empire from its remaining buildings.
Yeah.
And I was going to go to, I thought, how nice, I'll go to Raffles in Singapore. And then one publisher said, I'll commission this, but you have to choose one country. So I chose Egypt. And it was while researching that book, called Lifting the Veil, that I came across this detail that Gustave Flaubert, French novelist, 28 years old, and Florence Nightingale, at that point wealthy young lady, but not a nurse because her family had forbidden her to be, arrived in Alexandria the same week and took the same boat to Cairo, and then made parallel journeys up the Nile. And I thought, that is just so... And I'd found Florence Nightingale's unpublished letters from Egypt, which are eloquent, beautiful, evocative, extraordinary. And Flaubert wrote this, he wrote letters home, but he also had the letters he wrote to his mates talking about how many women he shagged. And, and it's really... the story was fantastic. The contrast between the two was brilliant. And I mentioned it in Lifting the Veil, and some nasty reviewer said he can get them onto the same boat, but he can't take them any further. And that ate away at me for about 20 years.
Ooh.
And then finally I thought, I've got to write that story. And my editor at the time said, you can't write a book where the two main characters don't talk to each other. And I said, I can. And I did. And he agreed afterwards that it worked. But it was that sense of wonder, surprise at these two characters, and also fascinating. I mean, I'd never really been particularly interested in Florence Nightingale, I have to say. This cantankerous, the view we have of this either this sort of sugar-sweet lady with the lamp, or the rest of her life, which is another 50 years, sort of the healthcare campaigner. But here is a woman who's thwarted. She knows what she wants to do, but her social position won't allow her to do it. And there's a huge amount of feminism in her at that period, which is fascinating, and I knew nothing about. And she's really pushing against, because a woman of any standing, of any class in Britain in the 1849, when this takes place, was not free. She couldn't just take herself off. She was her father's property, and when she got married, she'd be her husband's property. And she's rattling against the chains of that. And I thought that was fantastic. And it was also that these two characters, so she has a sort of spiritual journey. Literally, she's hearing God talking to her in the temples.
Mm.
And Flaubert is terribly bored by the temple. He says, like visiting churches in Brittany, something you have to do. It's just awful. But he loves the women in particular. He has a lot of sex. and he loves the colors, and he's he's written his first novel just before he went to Egypt, and his friends have told him to burn it because it's so awful. And he's tormented. Will I ever write again? Whatever. And he goes home and he writes Madame Bovary. And it's that transition. She goes home and she becomes a nurse. So it's the turning point for both of them. And I just thought, that's a great story. That really worked. And that's what I tried to do in the book.
I remember, I loved reading Winter on the Nile, and I loved rereading it just last week. You seem to have far greater an association and admiration for Florence than you do for Flaubert. Is that right?
My agent at the time, the much lamented, much missed Gillian Aitken, said, the whole world is going to have to decide which boat they'd rather be on. And I know which one I'd rather be. I'd rather be with Flaubert. And I thought, well, actually, Flaubert, he's great and all that sensuality and stuff. But I thought that, she's a much more interesting character at that point than he is. He's just sad. And even Flaubert was traveling with a friend of his, Maxime Ducamp, who's so frustrated with him that he wants to send him home. He says, you just lie there on the divan all day and do nothing. And later, which is a beautiful sort of recognition on the part of Ducamp, he says Flaubert appeared to look at nothing, but he saw everything. And I thought that, and he understood everything. It's just such a beautiful sort of acknowledgement from a lesser writer of the brilliance of this man.
Okay, let's tease this apart, Andy, because I'm fascinated in this in you. So I can understand you find a connection between one of France's great novelists and, of course, the nurse, if you will, Florence Nightingale.
Yeah.
I can see why you think, okay, right, this I'm going to commit to. This is going to be a book. I've got a clear path. This is going to be fascinating. And I know how much research you put in, how much commitment you bring to it. But any writer worth their salt has 2 or 3 ideas a day, most of which are discarded. Can you talk us through how it works with you when you think, oh, actually, no, this is the idea I'm going to commit to because it's a commitment of your time, of your talent, of your agent's time and talent, of your publisher. There are commercial implications and so on. How do you sift out the good from the bad in terms of the welter of ideas that any writer has?
Well, I'm not sure I always do sift out the bad. But
history would seem to suggust you have a good talent for it.
They sit in my head for a long time. They do. The gestation period is long. I mentioned 20-something years between 87 to 2010 or whatever, 2012. So a long time. And I think in that process, an awful lot of things here, trying to write or trying to put together a proposal for a big book on how the ancient world had shaped the way we go about things. Why do some people live in buildings that have that have sort of mock Roman porticos or Greek elements on the front of their buildings? We walk into it, we don't even think about it anymore. But where does that come from? And that then fell apart in a way because it became about archaeology, and and the influence of discoveries in the Age of Enlightenment on Europeans, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. Until a friend turned around and said, "This will be the thing they place under your head when you're buried." And I thought, not me, mate. Not this. I put it aside. And my agent has spent time. I'd be sat through various meetings with publishers and things like that. And I just suddenly thought, actually, I don't want to write this anymore. And
that must be devastating, though, Anthony.
It's quite difficult. I mean, if there have been big gaps in my publishing history. I wrote a novel, for instance, I'd had a book commissioned by Jonathan Cape. Jonathan Cape was the publisher that I had wanted to do when I first started writing. I was writing fiction. I thought, they're the publisher for me. Jonathan Cape, Britain's, I thought they were publishing the best fiction in Britain at the time. And they were the people who, and then I got published by Jonathan Cape, and it was like, yes! But then I wrote a book that I committed a couple of years to it, and I wrote it traveling around. I spent a year and a half traveling around the world, and so a month in each place. And I wrote a chapter in each chapter came from a different place, but it wasn't about that journey, and yet in a way it became about the journey. But I was the book was set in a place that has no location. I don't tell you where it is. Yeah. I give you descriptions of landscape. It's two people traveling towards the same place, but I never. And I wrote it. I spent a couple of years doing it, and my agent loved it, and it didn't sell, and I was absolutely devastated because I invested so much time and effort, and I couldn't understand why nobody would publish it. And agents were right. I mean, editors were writing letters saying, what a fantastic writer, what beautiful thing, but it's just not going to work in the current market. Mm. Which then I thought, well, okay, so am I writing for the market? I'm not. I'm writing because I have to write these things. I'm not writing because obviously I'd love to sell 1 million copies. Obviously I'd love to win every prize out there, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm writing it because I want and I need to write these stories. And it's partly about working things out for myself or in myself. That's why. I might sound a bit pretentious, but that is why I write.
No, actually, to be honest, I'm rather touched by what you say. It doesn't sound pretentious in the slightest, but I really hear the honesty and how this comes from a very sort of deep place in you. Let's come to a more recent book, Anthony. The dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. What on earth made you decide to spend so much time writing about a man who had an obsessive childhood interest in brass rubbing and then wandered over the Middle East in a bespoke suit and hobnail boots?
Well, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. I'd seen the film when I was a kid or whatever, when it came out, and so he was there in the landscape, and whenever you approach a camel in the Middle East, someone is going to mention Lawrence of Arabia.
Right.
But I wasn't terribly interested in him until I was in Syria, and it was in a time when it wasn't easy to get into Syria, and I'd had to go in as a journalist, and because no Europeans were being allowed in at the time, and so I've had to sort of pull strings. I went in as a Sunday Times journalist, and I was up at Crac de Chevalier, this amazing medieval fortress castle, and I was sleeping just outside the fortress, and somebody mentioned in a cafe Lawrence of Arabia, and that he had been here to this castle, and he'd written about it as a student, and I thought, I know nothing about that. And when I got back, I discovered, that Crusader Castles was his thesis for his history degree at Oxford, and was in print. And I read it, and I loved the backstory of it, the passion of it. But I put that away, and I just thought, okay, that's and I mean that was 1989, 1990. And I started working on young Lawrence in whenever it was, 2012, I think, something like that. 2010. So again, another 20-year gestation. I knew I'm going to need to live a long, long time.
I mean, you say. Sorry, carry on.
But I also by then I had two. Both my sons were out of their teens, or approaching the moment in life when they have to think about who they are and what they're going to do. And I thought, well, I love this story of young Lawrence, of the making of this man, because he goes from being the second of five sons of a what appears to be a middle class Oxford family, to being Lawrence of Arabia and uncrowned king of Arabia and all that stuff. And I thought, how do you do that? Yeah. How and that sense of sort of of making yourself. And he clearly at the beginning had no idea that was what was going to happen to him. And so I thought, that's the story. And in a way, it's it's the prequel to the movie, I suppose. I mean, I would love somebody to make the movie of what happened before the David Lean, Peter O'Toole film. And it's the making of the man.
It's the making of the man, exactly. So yes, I mean, he grows up in his parents lived in a bungalow in Oxford. If I remember.
He has such a tormented relationship with his mother in particular that they build him a bungalow.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
at the end of the garden. I mean, the house is quite big enough for
okay.
5 kids, but no, he has to be out. So they build this, and it's a very nice bungalow. It's still there. It was up for sale, the house with the bungalow. If you happen to have £2.5 million or whatever.
Sadly, not.
No.
I like the fact that I learned from this that he was Ned Lawrence to his parents.
That's right. Yes, and of course, and that's the story that sort of becomes more and more fascinating, because I didn't realize that they're not Lawrence's at all. And
yeah, quite.
And this is the thing that animates his whole youth, and that is that he gets the idea that there's something not right about his parents' relationship, and he decides that he's illegitimate, that his mother is his mother, but his father is not his father, and has sort of stepped in to do the decent thing.
Yeah.
Whereas, in fact, the reality is more complicated. They are his parents, but his father was an Anglo-Irish, baronet, Sir Thomas Chapman, and ran off with the governess, who he got pregnant, and who he then they never get married, because Chapman was married to a Catholic woman who won't divorce him. So Chapman changes his name to Lawrence, sets up with the governess, eventually in Oxford. They travelled around for years and years and years, and they have 5 children and bring them up in this house in Oxford. But imagine being brought up with no family background. There's no story about who we are, because we're not Lawrence. But there's no sort of distant relatives, no founding myths. So he creates his own, and I thought that was so fantastic. But the thing that really set me off on that story was that he claimed he'd written a book about his travels in the Middle East before the First World War, and he burnt it in 1914 when he went off to war. And I thought, what are you trying to hide? So the other thing I tried to do was to try and, in a way, write the book that he might have burnt.
Oh, I see.
That story.
And did you get to answer the question of what you thought he was trying to hide?
It's a love story. That's what I'll tell you.
That's what we'll tell. The Ashmolean plays a role in this, because he was his travel was sort of started by a curator at the Ashmolean, if memory serves.
That's right. Yeah, with the director David Hogarth, who was who's a fascinating figure in himself. A very, very shadowy man, because he was a journalist for the Times. He was an archaeologist. He was head of the British school in Athens, so he did a lot of digging in Greece. Traveled around the Middle East, gave lectures, wrote books. Unlike a lot of archaeologists at the time, he needed to make money. And Lawrence was aware that he would have to make money as well. And he sort of looked at Hogarth as a father figure, but also somebody who he would like to emulate. And but Lawrence was you mentioned brass rubbing, but he's also collects things. There was a lot of construction going on in Oxford during his teenage years, and a lot of roads being dug up and buildings being pulled down, and he paid workmen to save any shards of bottles or pots or whatever else for him, and he gave them, a few pennies here and there for them, and he put some of these pieces back together and created Elizabethan bottles and medieval pots and donated them to the Ashmolean. He was the youngest donor on their records, and then they invited him to help, reorder their medieval collection. This is a schoolboy. I mean, extraordinary. So yeah, Hogarth then sends him traveling into the Middle East. Lawrence went to Oxford to study, to read history, and then his first year, he's very interested in medieval history because he has this, he's in love with the Arthurian legends, and nobility and purpose and of mind, beauty of mind, and his first summer at Oxford, he decides to cycle down to the south of France or around France. I think he cycles about 2,500 miles in about 6 or 7 weeks. I worked out it's about 50 miles a day, every day, for about 6 weeks. Now, you're a cyclist, as am I. Every day, they didn't have a sort of comfy saddles. He didn't have sort of chamois-lined shorts. And what's more, by that stage, he's a vegetarian. And what's more, that's not why he's doing it. He's there to stop off and make and record castles and cathedrals and things like that. And he's made ground plans and whatever. And I'd like to read you a bit, if I may, from my book, Young Lawrence, about him on that journey, because it's the first time. I mean, we take it for granted, many of us. It's the first time he sees the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a moment of revelation for him. And so he's been cycling for some weeks, and he'd been criticized for not revealing very much to his parents about how he was and whatever. So this is a very revealing letter for him. "I'm riding very strongly," he told his mother after a week in the saddle, "and feel very fit on my diet of bread, milk, and fruit. I begin on 2 pints of milk and bread, and supplement with fruit to taste till evening, when more solid stuff is consumed. One eats a lot when riding for a week on end at any pace. My day begins early. It's fearfully hot at midday." He's cycling in August in France. "There is usually a chateau to work at from 12 till 2, and then a hotel at 7 or 8. I've no time for sightseeing. Indeed, sometimes I wonder if my thesis is to be written this November or next. I find myself composing pages and phrases as I ride." His excitement was palpable, and it rose the further he rode along beautiful country lanes with their ox carts and up to high roads where he was chased by wild dogs. At the beginning of August, he reached Provence and the Mediterranean. It was a cloudy day, and he was standing at the top of a valley near Les Baux-de-Provence, above Arles, some miles from the sea. A green valley and sunburned fields stretched out beneath him. Beyond, there was a great grey sliver of horizon. He stood for a while to take in the enormity of the view across the landscape, and as he did so, the sun came out, and a sort of silver shiver passed over the grey, and then I understood and instinctively burst out with a cry of "Thalassa, Thalassa!" The sea that echoed down the valley and startled an eagle from the opposite hill. The young man from the north was quoting the famous cry of Xenophon and his 10,000 Greek soldiers when, in 400 BC, they caught sight of the Black Sea on their way home from Mesopotamia. Lawrence had just caught his first glimpse of the Mediterranean. In his excitement, he shouted so loudly that 2 French tourists came running to see whether someone was being murdered. They were not. This was a beginning, not an end. He cycled down through Arles to Aigues-Mortes, where the town thrilled him with its intact medievalism. A lovely place, with hardly a house outside its old walls, still absolutely unbroken and hardly at all restored or in need of it. He'd now arrived at one of those rare moments when the way forward in life becomes clear. He went to bathe in the Mediterranean just outside the town. The great sea, he wrote that night, the greatest in the world. You can imagine my feelings. The day was lovely, warm, a light wind and sunny. The sea had not our long rolling breakers, but short dancing ripples. And then he quoted lines from the poet Shelley. I love all waste and solitary places, where we taste the pleasure of believing what we see is boundless, as we wish our souls to be. It could stand as a motto for the next phase of his life.
Beautifully written and beautifully read. Thank you so much for reading for us, Anthony.
You're welcome.
You like hearing, author's own words in author's own voice. Let me ask you this, finally, on Lawrence. When you're writing about somebody, as I know to my own cost, you go through phases of liking them, sometimes loathing them, sometimes admiring them, sometimes sympathizing with them, often being frustrated with them, because, of course, we're seeing everything in hindsight. How did your relationship with Lawrence change over the writing of this?
Well, I mentioned that I wasn't, obviously I was swept up by the Peter O'Toole image of him, but I wasn't terribly taken by the older man. I read bits of Seven Pillars of Wisdom, but not the whole thing. And I picked up bits on my way around the Middle East in all the years that I'd spent there. But I was fascinated by the younger man because the older man is so difficult to understand. I mean, he intentionally goes about obscuring the image of himself. He was famously described as backing into the limelight, and he absolutely does. He became the poster boy for the First World War quite by chance, because in 1917, when the Americans had decided to enter the First World War, they sent journalists to Europe and the Middle East to find stories that would sort of keep the American public on side with the government's decision to send troops. And so there's this journalist called Lowell Thomas who arrived in Jerusalem, went to see General Allenby, who was head of the British force in the Middle East, and thinking that there was a story there. And Lawrence happened to be there. He was in the middle of sort of doing what Lawrence did at that point, which is blowing up Turkish trains and in the Hijaz. But he happened to be in Jerusalem just then, dressed as an Arab. And Allenby said, well, why don't you go with him? And it was sort of quite by chance. And that, and after the war, Allenby, who had taken film footage, made Lawrence this hero because he cut together the film. And I mean, millions and millions of people paid money to go and see this film in the early 1920s. And Lawrence became a hero. And he, on the one hand, said, I hate everything to do with it. I hate this sort of charade, because he felt he had failed his Arab friends. He'd failed personally in the war. And yet he was being made as a hero. And so everything he does after that is a two-way thing. On the one hand, he appears to be encouraging it. On the other hand, he's making it very difficult to see exactly what's happening. And yet, with the early life, because there isn't that fame, it's much easier to get hold of the character. And even then, he's not straightforward. He's very, very complicated because of his anxiety about his parentage.
Right.
And so, there are moments when you think, yeah, I've got you. And then he slips away and you think, oh, God. Oh, God. But it's also that he's, when as the details fill in, I mean, he was a very short man. Yes. Certainly not taller than 5'5". He might have been 5'3", and we only know that because the army kept on shifting the parameter for the minimum height depending on how many recruits they needed.
Right.
And that informs part of his character. And he's the cycle around France when in his first summer at Oxford, and then the following summer he walked around Syria and through Palestine and Lebanon on foot, on his own, in summer. This short guy, blonde hair, blue eyes, little backpack with a very expensive camera and a pistol, and he's just making himself tough. But he doesn't know what he's preparing himself for. Later, he says, I was preparing myself for the task ahead. But I know for a fact that in the summer of 1914, he had no idea that a world war was about to start.
We should let people discover more of him by reading Young Lawrence, a portrait of the legend as a young man, and of course the big question mark over his relationship with Jahum, and of course his friendship, his confidence with E.M. Forster, of course, which is incredibly enlightening in your book. It's also, I've just had a read, you and I have both stood on a train at various points that was derailed by T.E. Lawrence. They're still there, some of them, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yes. The Hijaz Railway, parts of it is still running, and that also was part of it. I mean, that first time I went to Syria in Damascus, they still had the old railway timetable from the First World War pinned to the wall of the Hijaz railway station, and an old steam train was still sitting there on the track. You think, wow, this is history you can touch, and I love that sort of thing.
Me too. One last question to you, before we completely run out of time. And I'm going to ask it this way, if I may. You are renowned for being one of the preeminent travel writers of our age. Two questions for you. In a world of blogs and travel blogs and everybody wanting to write about their travels, what would your top tip be about what good travel writing is? And the second part of the question is, where do you tend to write from? I know some people are slightly obsessive. I'm not least amongst them, about where one writes from and how important it is to one's writing.
Top tip first. I think what stands for travel writing stands for all sorts of writing, and that is, it's not just about describing where you are. It's about understanding it, and it's about understanding your relation to it. I mean, there's this famous line which is sort of bandied about a lot: only connect. If you can just connect and find some truth between yourself and this thing you're trying to write about. And obviously, if you're writing a bit of journalism, it's not quite the same. And a lot of blogging at the moment is quite straightforward. But there's some fascinating things out there as well. And I think we live in a very exciting time. I mean, terrible in some ways, but very interesting in others, because as things crack up, as our world cracks up, the light comes in. I mean, this event, this lockdown LitFest, is one thing that's come. There's all sorts of opportunities for writing now that weren't there before. When there was more of a sort of this solid mass of there. If you're not writing for this newspaper or this magazine, then you're not going to get read. Well, now you can get read all over the place, and I think that's an exciting thing. And where I write from, well, I famously go and write by myself. I hide myself away, and I've been doing that, since I was sort of 22, going off and sitting somewhere, preferably where there's no one else around. And I've been lucky to have no people who are prepared to lend me places that when they're not there. I'm a very good house sitter, but there's a place. I have a friend with a lovely friend with a house down in southern France, inland under a cliff, and it's perfect for hiding away. And particularly in winter, when it's a village where anybody who can leave does leave in the winter. So you walk in the streets, there's nobody there, and I need that. Because I tend to write. Apart from what I'm writing at the moment, which is taking forever, I usually write a first draft of a book very quickly, because I don't write until I'm ready to do the whole thing, and then I want to just get it down, and then I rewrite and rewrite. And so it's good to do that in isolation and try over the space of a few months just get the whole thing down.
You say about in isolation, you've been locked down with your wife, with your children, and with one of your boys' girlfriends, I understand. So you're in quite a bubble. Can we end on your wife, please? She's done a rather interesting initiative, which is increasingly important as lockdown is being released and we all have to wear masks. Can you tell us what Sylvia's been up to?
That's right. Well, my wife is an artist, but she's also somebody who who's never idle. She's always using her hands. And as soon as I mentioned we were in Egypt, and as soon as we got back to London, she realized that a mask would be a good thing to have. So she made masks for us. And we were walking in the road, and somebody we know said, "Oh my God, those are so fantastic! Please, can I have one? Can you make one for me?" And then various other people wrote saying, "Can you make them for me?" And so Sylvie started making them, and then thought, I said, "How many are you going to make?" She said, "Well, maybe 10." And when it got to 30, she said, "Well, actually, I can do this, and I can raise money." And so she started putting the proceeds towards the food bank, the Trussell Trust. And then the Black Lives Matter movement, and then various women's organizations, and the Syrian Hands Up Foundation as well have had donations. And so, it's gone very, very well. And she's made hundreds and hundreds of them and donated thousands of pounds. And now we all have to wear a mask. There's more and more. And should you wish find out more, you can look at her name is Sylvie Franquet, Sylviefranquet, and she's on Instagram and on Facebook, and there's all sorts of models there, and it's a very good cause. And what's more, you'll look the coolest person on the street.
And people can buy them through these sources. How do they get hold of them?
You can buy them through, you can contact her through Instagram. There's also Condé Nast Traveler have very kindly put it on their website as well.
Exactly. We both have friends in Syria. We both love Syria. I spoke to some pals in Aleppo recently. It's not looking good there. Some people are able to get broadband, and some people in Syria are watching Lockdown LitFest. What would you say to Syrians who might be looking in, who are pals?
Oh, my pals.
I think you just said it. I think you just said it, Anthony. I think you just said it. While we're talking here about books, there are people who are talking about much more serious things in many ways. Anthony, I'm sorry to have dropped that on you, but actually it's interesting to see just how with this fantastic technology of video conferencing, sometimes words aren't enough. Thank you.
Really not.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Can you give us any insight into what you're writing now?
Yes, well, I did start writing a book about Syria before the Civil War started, and because I had a very dear friend, a filmmaker called Nabil Malek, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but who explained to me that there was a unique dynamic about Damascus, and while the rest of the Middle East was blowing up, Damascus would hold firm because of its long tradition and its architecture and something else. And I said, oh, that's not true. But every time I went to Damascus, he would walk me around, usually late at night, and tell me stories about the place. And I thought, this is a book. This is a wonderful book about the mystery. He said the United Nations were doing research into trying to work out what it was about Damascus that was so extraordinary. And I thought, yeah, okay, well, maybe I should try and do that as well. And then the place blew up, and that didn't happen. But no, I'm writing a book. I'm actually writing it. I realized because I was thinking about what I was, about this conversation we were going to have. I think for the first time, I'm actually writing a book for myself.
What?
And I mentioned, for instance, Lawrence I had my children in mind, and every other book I've had somebody else in mind, but actually I've just got myself in mind, because I'm trying to explain something about myself, and it's about nomads and how they have shaped our world. I mean, I don't think of myself as a nomad, because a nomad to me is not somebody who travels a lot, but somebody whose life is a journey. And I have moments where I'm a homeboy. I'm really, really happy to be home and sort of, polish things. and I don't, my parents were antique dealers. I've got too many possessions to be a true nomad in that sense. But I'm trying to work that out, and so it's turned into a big history from the Neolithic Revolution, from 9,500 BC and Cain and Abel to you and me today. And I'm just coming to the end of it. It's been 5 years of extraordinary sort of roller coaster ride of why am I doing that? And I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it to answer this question about why do I move? Why do I move? And why do we all move? Why do we all feel that some of us feel this incessant need to keep on going? And yet I'm not a nomad.
Anthony, can you please get off this literary festival stage? Get yourself to the lockdown and finish this book, because I really want to read it.
Next year, I hope you'll see it.
A previous guest on this show, Robert Twigger, of course, has written the best line about nomadism I've read in some years, which is, you may be aware, in his book, The Great North Line, where he writes, "No madness is no madness."
Yeah, that's right.
I wish I'd thought of that.
Yeah.
Anthony, it's been a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for the generosity of your answers and for the gift of your time. Thank you so much for talking to us about young Lawrence, about A Winter on the Nile, and of course about The Gates of Africa, all of which we highly commend to our audience. And we'll figure out which one we're going to push, if not all three of them, through our Buy the Book button beneath this. Anthony Sattin, it's been an absolute pleasure. Please look after yourself. Thank you so much for coming to join us here on the Lockdown LitFest.
Thanks, Paul. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Me too.
Bye.
There we go, folks. Africa, Middle East, T. Lawrence. a nurse and a novelist. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Lockdown LitFest. As ever, we hope you're keeping safe. We hope you're keeping well. And we send our wishes to all in Syria who may be tuning into this. Look after yourselves. Cheerio.